The 11th century had seen an increased sacralization of warfare in the Latin West. This was in part due to reform movements within Western Christianity more broadly, which sought to raise standards for clerical and monastic comportment, including banning the marriage of priests. The 11th century also saw a movement to use Christian piety as a means of mitigating the worst impacts of warfare. After decades of feudal anarchy in much of France, the so-called Peace of God movement sought to place restrictions on violence, in particular by forbidding the targeting of churches and clergy. Visions of knighthood became increasingly sacralized, as the practice of knighting aristocratic youths as a rite of passage was oftentimes preceded by fasting, prayer, and confession. Now, in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the late 11th century AD, the Byzantine Empire suffered a series of dramatic military setbacks against a new threat, the Seljuk Turks. The Turks had long been employed as soldiers by the Abbasid Caliphate, but as the Abbasids suffered steep dynastic decline, the Turks now proved senior partners in the relationship and set about carving out their own domain. The Byzantine emperor, Alexios Komnenos, long accustomed to employing northern mercenaries, appealed to the Pope in Rome for military aid. In 1095, Pope Urban II gave a speech urging Christians to come to the aid of the Byzantine Empire, and more ambitiously, to retake Jerusalem. Urban suggested that military service might be penitential in nature, a good work that might help to balance out past sins. It seems that many in the audience heard a more radical proposition. Those who crusaded would be guaranteed salvation. The first phase of the First Crusade was a tragic farce. A holy man known as Peter the Hermit organized the so-called People's Crusades, mostly untrained peasants along with some low-level knights. One of the first acts of this movement was a series of massacres of Jews living in the Rhineland, spearheaded by a petty German noble, Emicho of Folkheim. Some of the People's Crusaders were subsequently killed as they pillaged their way to the Holy Land, especially in Hungary, and those that reached Anatolia were massacred by the Seljuk Turks. It took some months for a well-planned and well-supplied expedition, the so-called Prince's Crusade, to launch, led by a coalition of high nobles. The combined forces were perhaps 30,000 men, mostly Franks. The Emperor Alexios, no doubt nervous at the prospect of so many heavy cavalry in his realm, quickly transported the Crusaders across the Bosphorus and wished them luck. Crusaders worked their way across Anatolia and besieged Antioch in northern Syria, which was captured after an 8-month investment. After massacring many of the inhabitants, the Crusaders were besieged in turn by a relieving Muslim army. Starving and desperate, the Crusaders rallied when it was announced that a lance had been discovered in Antioch, supposedly the very same lance with which Christ's flank was pierced as he hung on the cross. While some Germans of the army refused to believe this, there was another supposed lance that was on display in Vienna. The report of the miraculous discovery of the relic rebooted the flagging morale of the Crusaders, who sallied forth from the gates of Antioch and defeated the Islamic forces in pitched battle. After some dissension, the Crusaders attacked south, mostly due to the desire of rank-and-file knights to capture Jerusalem, even as many of the leaders were beginning to feel content with the project of carving out Near Eastern fiefdoms for themselves. Jerusalem was at this point held by the Fatimids, a recent Arab dynasty that had arisen in Egypt, which controlled parts of the southern Levant and North Africa. Racing against time before a Fatimid relief army could muster and land, the Crusaders used siege towers to enter the walls and capture the city in 1099. A horrific massacre of Jews and Muslims followed, so that the streets of Jerusalem allegedly flowed knee-deep in blood. By now, a sizable Fatimid army had landed at Ascalon. The Crusaders were badly outnumbered, but again, the discovery of a supposed relic was used to bolster flagging morale. This time, it was perhaps the ultimate Christian relic, a fragment of the true cross, supposedly, upon which Christ had been crucified, which had been discovered through the torture of Orthodox priests in Jerusalem, who had hidden the fragments for safekeeping. Religiously inspired, the Crusaders were also lucky. The Fatimid commander practiced poor operational security. The Crusaders, whose army was perhaps not much larger than 10,000 men at this point, won a crushing victory over the much larger but poorly deployed Fatimid force. At the end of 1099, many Crusaders began to return home to their native lands. But a number of barons, supported by a small number of troops, remained behind to exploit a series of so-called Crusader states, the most important of which was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The First Crusade therefore intersects with a number of the big themes of our course. The land grabs that created the Crusader states certainly represent the theme of war as exploitation. But ultimately, the Crusades were the violent manifestation of cultural constructs. Crusaders risked their lives because they believed it would bring them permanent salvation in their afterlife. They murdered Jews in the Rhineland and again in Jerusalem in retaliation for the death of Jesus. And they sought to retake Jerusalem, not for any strategic reason, but because of its centrality in Christian geography.